Our story is one of a greater love, even more so than the Prince of Wales could ever have dreamt about. If anyone stood in his way, it was his wife. His life seemed torn apart to the press, but privately he adored one woman more than anyone else. Testing times lay ahead, and maybe the whole House of Windsor was preparing for a complete demolition. This will be one moment in history that would certainly stand the test of time. At the start of 1992, there was a feeling of impending disaster. Charles and Diana had come to a crossroads in their life and marriage. The complications of others would only serve to break up the couple even more. A tour of India had been planned and the Prince and Princess were committed to carrying out this royal visit, but neither had the stomach or need to be together at this point. On the surface, people knew of the difficult circumstances, but internally it was a raging volcano about to erupt. Join me now as we unravel the shocking story of a royal love triangle. And please don't forget to like the video and consider subscribing for more historical stories. The petty nature between Charles and Diana grew. Diana had befriended Mother Teresa of Calcutta. However, when she was recovering from a heart condition, flowers were sent as if from the couple, but Charles insisted only his name be attached to the message. This mindless bickering and internal squabbles did no more than drive the wedge between them even further. Diana would stand alone at the Taj Mahal in India, a sad reflection of the ever-widening gap between the couple. Charles remained in Delhi, addressing a group of business leaders. Charles's absence from his wife spoke volumes to the press, and they declared it an apparent snub. On the eve of St. Valentine's Day, Charles played polo at Jaipur. At the end of the game, he stood in line with his teammates, awaiting a trophy from his wife. The world's media attended to see if they would kiss or not. They didn't wait long. It was described at the time as one of the most cruelest put-downs of a man by his wife. Diana waited until her husband's lips were almost upon hers, before turning her head to the left. It was a total humiliation to Charles. Once again, Diana had upstaged him, but this would be the last time. Diana took the children to Lech in Austria, a traditional spring break skiing in March. Charles didn't go, preferring to remain in Scotland with the now ever closer Camilla. It was the start of the no more Mr. Nice Guy routine for Charles. The days of family photos seemed a long way off now. Tempers flared and passions grew stronger. Charles attempted a charm offensive to win back the hearts of the British public, but so much had happened, this was one return to hopeful popularity that would not be easily won. It backfired when news suddenly broke that Diana's father, Earl Spencer, had suddenly died. Probably in the most troubling time for Diana, Charles was considered absent by his presence. It was as though no one cared about helping the world's most famous woman with her overwhelming sadness. The couple headed for Kensington Palace, where Diana was left with the boys. Charles immediately left for Highgrove and Camilla. The standoff lasted for some time. Charles's private secretary called upon the Queen to step in. Charles, who was now 43, once again had to rely on his mother to settle his domestic argument. But it wasn't just a minor skirmish. It had significant repercussions on the couple's future, and now the relationship had reached a breaking point. Charles and Camilla wanted to find a way to unravel his most unhappy marriage, but that was something that would take great planning. The boys had to be taken into account, but their main task was what to do with Diana, the woman Camilla now dubbed the Mouse. After the funeral of Earl Spencer, Charles returned briefly to Althorpe House, where he spoke with Diana's brother, who said Charles did not seem to understand I had just buried my father, yet he kept telling me how lucky I was to have inherited so young. Charles then continued and said, I wish I had inherited so young, but my parents don't trust me with anything. Charles fled the scene by helicopter before the proceedings were over, claiming a prior engagement in Gloucester, but that engagement was one of falling back into the arms of Camilla. A month later, Charles was in Turkey on holiday, and Diana was in Cairo at lunch, and answered a question when a lull occurred in the conversation. At that point she proclaimed, "I still see myself as Lady Diana Spencer." The answer was shocking for those there. The former Minister of Culture pointed out that she had been the Princess of Wales for more than a decade, so what would happen when her husband became king? Diana replied, "I'll always be Lady Di." A shocking disclosure, and everyone knew now the end was nigh, even though her marriage would continue for a further 7 months. Over the intervening months, Charles played it cool. He gave none of the media a chance to catch him with Camilla, and upon returning from the East, Charles and Diana would once again be swift to move. They were set to go to Spain for the Expo World Trade Fair in Seville, but within days of this trip, it became clear that this marriage had crashed upon the rocks of the Mediterranean Sea and was now sinking fast. In retrospect, Diana did regret the publication of Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story, classed as the most grievous blow ever inflicted on the royal family since the days of Edward VIII's abdication. Yet the damage was essentially self-inflicted. The shadow of Camilla haunted Diana. It was an emotional helter-skelter she could do nothing about, and quite possibly only her words could bring about the truth. Diana suffered through this decade more than most would say. Bulimia, parenting, and the inner brigade at Buckingham Palace, as she advised, made her life hell. It all came tumbling out in the form of messy and confusing statements, which finally spilt out the angriest, saddest, and quite possibly the most damaging wounds ever inflicted on the House of Windsor. Diana's problem with the story was that it dwelled on Camilla and her husband, yet left out her own questionable relationships with the likes of James Gilby and James Hewitt.
Did you love James Hewitt?
Yes, it did. Yes.
Were you unfaithful?
Yes, I adored him. Yes, I was in love with him. But I was very let down.
Although her grievances were legitimate, they effectively wrecked all the excellent work she had done previously. Attempting to nullify the roles is impossible, yet her self-obsessed one-woman rant did no more than turn attention back to them. In the end, Diana would lose. The dream was gone. Her flawless, caring beauty turned sour. The once private conflict was now very much a public story. She still held the upper hand by stating Charles had cheated on her all their married life, hoping the British public would accept her narration, but this backfired, which then turned into a grave miscalculation. Diana's true story did more than punish the royal family. It brought them to their knees. Those who knew Diana said it was never her aim to go that far. It was simply a way to expose her marriage for what it was. But finally, the unacceptable behaviour driven towards her would create a collapse, and Diana would take the blame for the dramatic loss of credibility for the House of Windsor. When the press confronted Camilla about the book, she said, "I haven't read it, but will with interest when the time comes." Claims were made that Camilla spent much time away from her husband to be with Charles. It fell upon one of the royal bodyguards to say, "Camilla steps right into Diana's shoes. Charles is closer to her than anyone else in the world." Privately, the royal corridors of power were shaking and the atmosphere grim. The unthinkable had happened, a royal princess giving away secrets about the family. The long-term implications would prove fatal. Anger and hatred built, alarm turned to panic, and for the first time in royal circles, Diana had no one to lean on. And in some eyes, the one person to blame was in fact Diana.
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
Camilla jumped into the spotlight and arrived, some say bravely, others foolhardily, at a polo match. The Queen welcomed her, and later the two of them chattered over tea. No one knows what was said, but I'm sure we can all imagine. Although the surprise of this visit was staggering, her clothing gave more clues to what was going on, as she wore a grey suit, the Prince of Wales check. Diana was clearly not in control now, and things had moved on swiftly. A new unity and public gesture suggested there was far more to the story than initially revealed in the book. Within a week, Diana faced the enormity of what she had done. She'd not seen the book yet sanctioned it before final publication, and when Diana was visiting a hospice in Southport, many had gathered to wish her well. But then suddenly, she covered her face and wept. The Times had caught up with Diana. She was sobbing and looked terribly upset. She was hurriedly put into a waiting car and driven to RAF Woodville, where she asked for a glass of water and to be left alone. She stayed for 20 minutes before arriving at her next engagement late, with the police officer stating there had been a mechanical fault with her car. The Royals didn't know what to do at Royal Ascot in this year. In a newspaper serialisation, more lurid secrets about the couple had appeared just days before, casting even more doubt and confusion, which saw Charles and Diana not only arrive together, but leave. Although undaunted by the gossip, as he called it, Charles continued to talk with Camilla, and more importantly, what should happen next. Camilla's house, though, was now under siege from the press. They wanted answers. One reporter said letters had been arriving for Camilla saying Princess Diana is a goddess, and how dare Camilla do anything to upset, hurt, or even damage her happiness. In the end, the Parker Bowles moved house and changed all their phone numbers. Camilla would later leave the country for some respite and attempt to shake off the ever-growing press and media. Charles, in the meantime, drove to Windsor for a crisis meeting with the Queen. Diana said at this meeting, "I know my duty." But the public opinion had swung so far from Charles that he was struggling. Sometimes in life an opportunity arises that's maybe just too good to turn down. Well, a man called Cyril Renan had one such opportunity when he unwittingly found himself at the centre of a royal battle and a scandal that made Diana's book seem like nothing more than a work of fiction. Renan had listened to a phone call between Diana and James Gilby. It became known as the Squidgy Tapes. Renan might have thought he'd be knighted for this, and although this royal knight in shining armour gave some credibility back to the family, for Diana, the exchanges showed how far she had strayed from what the majority believed. But for Charles and Camilla, the tapes were a godsend. For the moment, they were safe, but not out of the woods. Enough was enough now, and the palace started setting plans for separation in motion. Later that year, a memorial service was held at Westminster Abbey to reflect on the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. But the following morning, the press proclaimed Princess Snub's rival Aftershock at memorial service. It was a sad delivery of news when it should have been about so much more. This was arguably the lowest point of the affair. Both women loathed each other and never glanced once during the Abbey service. Charles stayed behind at the end so as not to pass Camilla for a second time. It was uncalled for and affected thousands of people who had no time for this threesome's quarrels, more so at a time when Thanksgiving should have been the attention of all. But it backfired for the royals, a national event completely misjudged by themselves and their advisors. Whether the parties involved didn't care anymore is unknown at this stage. They were all wrapped up so much in their own bubble that everything else seemed to fade into complete insignificance. It looked like a cuckoo nest, and Diana was the one about to be discarded. Westminster Abbey was not the venue if there was one place to be used for a public showdown for these two women on that particular day, especially when the scene was set to honour the war dead. One of the many combatants to attend was Major Bruce Shand, Camilla's father, a man who recalled the encounter 50 years ago. It was a piece of theatre as compelling as anything heard, but still overshadowed by a sombre threesome. Shand came out of the event with his head held high. His restraint in dignity was remarkable, yet he thought the media circus had threatened to rob the occasion. And just 3 weeks later, Andrew Morton's book now came out in paperback, stating Diana couldn't even face up to talking with Camilla, and in fact was now calling her the Rottweiler. Fleet Street knew by now the marriage was over between Charles and Diana. A trip to Seoul had been planned, but within moments of the couple stepping off the plane, royal watchers knew something had gone wrong. They had had a terrible argument aboard and emerged both red-faced and angry. The following 5 days would be the last together, and it became an unedifying spectacle. One journalist wrote, "It's a very public and very humiliating end to the love story of the century." But it came as no surprise when Prime Minister John Major announced to the House of Commons on the 9th of December 1992 that the Prince and Princess of Wales had decided to separate. He said the couple would continue to support their children and commit to their public duties.
I hope you can find it in your hearts to understand and to give me the time and space that has been lacking in recent years.
The Queen and Prince Philip both stated their sadness at the event, but hoped the intrusions into Charles and Diana's private lives would now end. The royal watchers knew, but the house was still shocked, and the TV broadcast by Major was riveting viewing for the thousands who had followed this story. For Camilla, there was no flag waving, and she did say, "Obviously, if something is wrong, I'm very sorry for them." She added, "I know nothing more than the average person in the street. I only know what I see on television." Camilla then left her home, driving into the night with her sister Annabelle, followed by a police escort. They arrived at the home of the Earl of Sherborne, a stately home that would achieve an even greater prominence over the coming weeks. No one today should be surprised at how this story panned out. Charles, as his predecessor, finally gave his heart to someone else, and again one who would be married. It is overall an imperfect love story, but as we all know, we live in an imperfect world.